happy to moderate this session. I was going to start actually with something, Hillary, that you mentioned there, which is something that I often talk about. And there's this notion that there is a lack of understanding or among the European big companies in the C-suite specifically around the strategic importance of open source. And actually it's something that I think that all panelists could come in. Actually we have sort of the EU advocacy representing SMEs, we have the research perspective, and then Peter, you're representing SAP. And obviously SAP is here, is investing in open source, engaging in open source. So it's a little bit like, okay, how can we unpack that finding to some extent? Because I think that that's not just companies. We're talking probably in Europe, there's a general understanding of open source that it's, that is somehow stuck in cost saving, this kind of mindset. And I mean, I think that, Sebastian, you're around as well when this sort of motivations, I think, were kind of driving interest in open source. So, Hillary, maybe you can start by telling us a little bit more how Europe differs. Maybe, Peter, you could come in and talk a little about SAP and how your journey with this, and, Sebastian also after that. Yeah?
Sure. Do you want me to start?
Hillary, yes, start. Okay. I want to have a conversation.
I think looking at the sample and that stat around open source maturity, when we survey our ecosystem, we survey all organizations, not just corporations. Mm. So some of those responses are from academia, and some of the responses are from public sector, nonprofits. And so we're not getting the full, it's not a purely corporate study, and so that might factor into the results for Europe, where a lot of the communities engaged in open source are, not necessarily from VCs or startups, but they're from a robust ecosystem in nonprofits and public sector, and so I think that might have an influence on the results.
Yeah. So, Sebastian, maybe you want to come in first and reflect a little bit on this. If in general you think the conversation that we're having around open source, that we are somehow, by going in and not talking about, meeting the challenges, or maybe not talking about software generally, you mentioned in your slides there that, and you challenged the audience to say, well, open source code is in all software. So, should we, are we having somehow, is the conversation too small because we are talking about open source in Europe? Does this mean that we feel like, we come across as being a niche interest or something like that? Do you have this feeling?
So I think this seems very, very loud. I think it's been quite easy to talk about open source in the public sector, because it is so obvious how open source benefits and how open source increases the sustainability of public investment. Public money, public code is a very good slogan for that kind of idea, and it works really well with policymakers when it comes to establishing open source in institutions and in administrations. And we are there. The European Commission runs its website on Drupal, and the servers run Red Hat, or used to run at least, on Red Hat Linux. So it's kind of been easy to get into that sphere, but obviously there is always the cost-cutting argument there. And there is always the question, but how does it actually benefit private sector or research, or how is it something that is important for economic development in Europe? And driving that realization is the work that we're trying to do, I think.
Peter, I would like you to come in on this as well. I don't know how much you can talk about sort of the SAP journey in the sense that you're a major European company, and obviously one that does see the strategic value of open source. you can talk also about sort of why you think that other companies that do not necessarily value open source to the degree that your company does.
Maybe first of all, I would like to connect to what you said, Sebastian, about 100% of software is more or less touching open source, right? I think for all SAP solutions, that's 100% true. You develop the software using open source IDEs like Visual Studio Code or Eclipse IDE. You use open source programming languages and compilers, versioning management systems. You deploy the software to open source operating systems like Linux. You use different libraries in your software. So I guess it's fair to say at SAP more or less every of our solutions is touching open source one way or the other. But when it comes to C-level awareness of the strategic importance, for me, innovation is the most important factor here. I think nowadays it's pretty obvious that no single company, not even Google or Microsoft, can outsmart the open source community, right? If you look at something like CNCF and what they are building there in the cloud native space, that is something no company can do alone on its own. And I think, especially for European companies, which oftentimes are a little bit smaller than Chinese or US companies, open source is a great way for leveling the playing field and for being part of this innovation cycle and from benefiting from these innovations that are coming from the outside. And in our own company, we wrote our on-premise business solutions with ABAP programming language, which is also still used today. And customers could see the code. They could read it, they could extend it, they could modify it. Of course, it was not licensed as open source, so it didn't have all the 4 freedoms. But the fact that they could see the code and change it and add to it, that was also co-innovation with the customers. And I think that was a big factor of SAP gaining so much traction and becoming so successful. So I think that is also, again, this innovation, co-innovation aspect, which you don't get with purely closed proprietary solutions.
All right, so you mentioned innovation. Also something that you mentioned in your presentation was this notion of investment protection. I think the title of this panel discussion is also around sort of public and private investment in the open source ecosystem. So obviously, the return on, like the innovation, access to innovation, that's one driver, but also specifically with regards to the IPSE projects and public investment. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about sort of the general learnings from that project and how open source is a way to protect public investment in projects like IPSE and others, actually. We had a discussion previously about sort of horizon projects and this notion of projects lasting for 3 years or something like this. And you talked about IPSE being sort of created in response to this this market failure. But how do you solve market failure by investing in a 3-year project? I mean, this is a little bit the issue, and what needs to happen in a way. I think Daniela's keynote was very interesting, about previous experiments, investments like this, where you have a political project, a political idea, and there's money on the table to build the technology. How can open source be a differentiator, if you will? Can we have such a political project again to invest in European digital sovereignty? And is open source maybe enabling a more positive outcome than we have seen previously? I mean, is this something you see that we can learn from what IPSE is doing?
Interestingly enough, even though IPSE is more or less mostly about software, to my knowledge, from these 112 organizations that are participating in IPSE, only very few are publishing their results as open source yet, so maybe they still decide to do so. But yeah, that's why when I presented this kind of blueprint that we try to use the public funding to incubate something and then turn it into a foundation to build a sustainable community lasting beyond the funding period, I would be happy if this is successful and maybe becomes a little bit a blueprint also for future public funded projects. So I think a lot of public funding is still done without open sourcing what is developed there, which is a little bit surprising to me.
Maybe, Sebastian, you're nodding a little bit and thinking about, did you want to come in at all thinking about this? Obviously, being in Brussels, looking at, the EU as a policymaker, and also investing in funding, and also the procurement perspective, which I brought up in my presentation. In a way, like, how can we leverage open source to make some of these initiatives more successful? I think maybe that's what I'm...
We really shouldn't underestimate how very unique this moment in time is, and how well the digital sovereignty narrative or the discussion that we're having works together with the arguments that we've made for decades. Yes. for open source and free software. I think in terms of policymakers, there is still a lot for them to learn, and opportunity to take advantage of. The possibilities that open source offers in making the SME landscape that we very much have in Europe work together and create together more. But maybe some encouragement is needed to make them publish more in open source. I think you've been mentioning public procurement, and I think the background for this is that the Commission is reforming the public procurement framework early next year. That's at least the plan. And they have a huge opportunity there to take real steps to make these things happen, to buy more open source, to make also the private sector understand how important open source is and how innovative it is, and how much of value creation that is currently outsourced to a company where I cannot influence the results, or where I don't have a possibility of making sure that the product will be there in a couple of years. Switching that over to open source and leveraging these possibilities, there's still a huge potential there. And I mean, in every news post that we make, on every submission to a public consultation, we say to the Commission, make use of this leverage. You have this huge lever in hand. There are a lot of open source experts throughout Europe. They might not all have companies, but they've all been trained on open source. At least that was the case when I was studying. Because what else would you use? The easily and readily available open source that you can look into how it's working, that you can modify and change for your own purposes. So everybody knows this in the industry, and understanding that as a policymaker is the key to things.
Hilary, I always find it interesting to read LF research reports for the comparative aspects. In previous reports, things like the way that open source is seen as a strategic skill, both on behalf of the individual developer. I mean, I think that it was also in the keynote earlier, we heard that the best engineers prefer to work in open source. And so, if you as an employer think strategically, you want to be where the developers are, et cetera. And I think this is something where in the US, I think is more recognized compared to Europe, for example. And I think, so those insights I think are very interesting. Also, when we talk about digital sovereignty, you mentioned that other continents or in other regions, they're also discussing those things. And I think that it's important to try to find a way to reconcile digital sovereignty with global collaboration, in the sense that it's not a zero-sum game, right? And Sebastian, you talked about the fact that we've had these discussions for ages, right? There's now a geopolitical aspect to it, which makes it more salient. But we have talked about sort of giving the user control over the digital assets for a long time. But I just wanted to see if you could add a little bit more to this this notion of the difference, how it's viewed in different continents, and also you talked about that in the EU there's a recognition of sovereign AI and the role of open source, I guess the open source place for sovereign AI. And maybe if you, from your research, have seen more about these regional differences, what arguments resonate? Because I think that's what it's about. You know, Sebastian, you had this list of, you know, kind of challenges, what policymakers are looking for. From Bosch, we heard they're not looking for open source. They're looking to, you know, in businesses are looking to solve problems, right? So, but do you see that there are different sort of arguments that are resonating in different regions?
Yeah, very much so. Earlier this week, we published a report on the value of open source AI in the APEC economies, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation region, which is hosting its meeting in Seoul, Korea, or not Seoul, beg your pardon, a different part of Korea this week. And APEC economies are diverse. There are advanced economies and there are developing economies. And the opportunities are different depending on the dynamics of the individual economy. For the developing economies, there's this leapfrog opportunity. There's the opportunity to leverage a mobile prolific population, for example, and opportunities to improve elder care or social benefits, healthcare, diagnoses, things like that. In advanced economies, the opportunities are quite specific to industry and manufacturing and competitiveness. So there is a lot of diversity in terms of how open source is leveraged in different regional contexts. I think for Europe, public funding need not fund something that doesn't necessarily exist, but have an objective of how can we modernize Europe's core industries and help our leaders continue to lead and compete, as well as nurturing startups simultaneously, and take the lessons from the leading European industry, which is, LF Energy. And a lot of these big European companies really do get it, and they really are global leaders. So I don't want anyone to walk away thinking, we're lagging here in Europe. There's some phenomenal leadership stories coming out of Europe. SAP, RTE, Oleander, Bosch, Mercedes-Benz, great companies doing great things with open source to help their organizations compete. So the opportunities depend on on the size of the organization, whether the economy is advanced or emerging.
Yeah. No, I think that that's something definitely, if we talk to policymakers, there should be a sort of, the motivation is important. It's can we still win, If you say that it's over, this is not going to motivate anybody. And I think that's just how also motivation works, even at the individual level. So these positive stories are important, and to sort of tell the story, this is how we win. So I was told, because of various issues we had, that we could run over a little bit, but I want to not take away too much from the coffee break, so I'm going to actually now move to sort of some final statements, let's say, because we had quite a wide-ranging discussion. And so maybe we should start on a kind of, or end on a positive note, or maybe like a wish list, let's say, or give a wish for how how do we, what's needed to position open source as a way to strengthen European digital sovereignty? Is that a good way to end? Yeah.
The thing is, I wanted to say this anyways, and I think it's a perfect introduction to saying this.
Okay.
But it starts with a negative.
Yeah.
I think sometimes when we approach policymakers and when they hear about the open source ecosystem in need of funding, in need of public funding, it can come across as very negative and as desperate, or like something is wrong with the ecosystem. While there is a responsibility for governments, administrations, the EU, to invest into open source because of the digital public infrastructure it is not in need or in desperate need of funding, or there's nothing wrong with the ecosystem, it's thriving. So I'll try to combine it with the question not for handouts, but with the question, can you buy more open source in public procurement? Because that money is already allocated. 60% of the IT budget in the EU comes from public procurement, so the money needs to be spent anyways. Why not spend it on open source rather on the established proprietary software? And then thereby also creating incentive, creating trust, and that sense of reliability that open source has for the private sector to make us all happy.
Good. How do we win?
How do we win?
Yeah.
I think it's incumbent upon us all in this room to sharpen our elevator pitch as advocates for open source in our discussion with leaders in the C-suite or leaders in government, to have 2 or 3 stats at the tip of our tongues around ROI. Sachiko, I'm going to quote your economic report on competitiveness and interdependence. What's the cost-benefit ratio? 1 to 4. We need to have these stats at the tip of our tongue and invite further conversation. But let's put the carrot out there with empirical evidence, bring people in and start those discussions and become advocate champions with facts in our back pocket.
Peter, how do we win?
Yeah, I think open source is ideally suited for especially Europe because it has this diversity aspect, and in a lot of companies, if you are a hardware company and selling drilling machines with digitization, nowadays you don't sell drilling machines, but you sell holes in a wall as a service, right? And for that you need some digital infrastructure, but that's not your core business. So on these commodity parts, to enable your differentiating services, if Europe teams up and builds these commodity parts as open source, and then the different companies differentiate on top of these commodity parts with their special services and their innovations, then I think that is kind of leveling the global playing field. So for me, open source is really the way to go for Europe.
I think that's a very positive note to end on, that this is actually an opportunity. There's an open source opportunity for Europe. Yeah, okay. And with that,
Well said.
Well said.
I want to thank the panelists, and we'll break for coffee. Yep, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.